In a blistering Washington showdown, Judge Beryl Howell gave Jasmine Crockett just 3 minutes to escape 15 days in a federal cell. The chamber froze as the nation's toughest judge tried to crush a congresswoman under contempt. But Jasmine unleashed precedent like a blade, flipping the courtroom on its head and leaving Howell reeling. Power cracked, silence shattered, and history tilted in seconds. Was this the moment Judge Beryl Howell's authority collapsed? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of Courtroom 22, every seat was filled, every breath held. Reporters clutched their pens like weapons. Law students whispered, then fell silent. The public gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, the tension crackling like static in the air. No one came for routine proceedings. They came for a showdown. And the moment Judge Beryl Howell stepped through the chamber doors, the atmosphere shifted like a storm rolling in. She didn't pause. She didn't smile. Her black robe flowed behind her like a curtain of finality. Eyes sharp, jaw locked, she marched straight to the bench and sat down without a word. Then with no preamble, she pointed directly at Jasmine Crockett and snapped, "Congresswoman Crockett, your careless statements yesterday have dishonored this courtroom. Approach the bench immediately." Gasps erupted. The press jolted forward. Jasmine didn't flinch. Judge Howell's voice turned ice cold. "This court is considering contempt. You have exactly 3 minutes to convince me why I shouldn't order the U.S. Marshal to place you in custody right now." She held up a printed transcript and read aloud, her tone laced with disdain. "While I respect the court's authority, today's ruling appears to disregard established precedent on protected political speech. The selective application of First Amendment standards raises serious questions about the decision-making process in these proceedings." She slammed the paper down and added, "That, Congresswoman, is not critique. That is a direct insult to the integrity of this court." The room froze. Not a cough, not a chair creaked. A sitting member of Congress had just been threatened with immediate arrest, live on record in front of the entire legal establishment. People weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were witnessing a public execution in slow motion, and the blade was already falling. The silence after the contempt threat was suffocating. People weren't just watching a legal proceeding anymore. They were witnessing something brutal, raw, and personal unfold right in front of them. And just when it seemed the moment couldn't grow more tense, Judge Beryl Howell leaned forward, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the bench. Her eyes locked on Jasmine with a venomous precision, and without warning, she began to dismantle her. Not with rulings, but with humiliation. "You think being a member of Congress gives you authority in here?" Howell's voice was cold, unblinking, and sharp as broken glass. "In this courtroom, you're nothing more than a small-town attorney with an oversized ego and no sense of place." The words hit like a slap across the face, measured, deliberate, cruel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sheer contempt in her tone did all the damage. A low murmur spread through the courtroom, not from outrage, but from discomfort. Howell wasn't just enforcing decorum anymore. She was going for the throat. She didn't stop there. Her gaze tightened, her words like bullets. "Don't mistake your press interviews for power. You're not here to grandstand. You're here because you crossed a line." Each sentence struck with surgical cruelty, reducing Jasmine not to her title, but to someone Howell wanted the room to see as reckless, arrogant, and small. There was nothing impartial about it. This wasn't justice talking. This was ego, and it was furious. Then came the final blow, louder, sharper, almost theatrical. "This court will not be used as a platform for personal branding. You're not some legal savior, Ms. Crockett. You're just another headline chaser who disrespects the dignity of federal proceedings." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Several law students looked away, visibly rattled. A reporter dropped her pen. The courtroom, moments ago merely tense, now felt radioactive. Even the security officers exchanged quiet, uneasy glances. But at the center of that firestorm stood Jasmine Crockett, motionless, expression carved from steel. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Her right hand gripped her folder like it was holding the weight of every case she had ever fought. She wasn't breathing heavy. She wasn't trembling. She was preparing. And it was in that exact stillness, under the weight of humiliation, under the glare of one of the most powerful judges in the country, that something shifted. Not in Howell, in the room. The audience could sense it, though they couldn't name it yet. Jasmine wasn't cornered. She was calibrating. And the courtroom had no idea that the woman Howell had just tried to break was already building her counterstrike. But for now, just for now, she stood silent, calm, coiled like a fuse, waiting for the spark. And now, with the entire room watching, some in awe, some in disbelief, she stepped forward like she was walking through fire with nothing to fear. Each step toward the podium echoed across the marble like a drumbeat of defiance. No one moved, no one whispered. All eyes were on her, yet she moved like the weight of judgment didn't belong to them, but to the bench. Jasmine stood tall, squared her shoulders, and fixed her eyes directly on Howell. She didn't blink. She didn't bow. And when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. It cut clean and deep. Your Honor, before you carry out your threat, I feel obligated to remind the court that the Supreme Court ruled in Bridges versus California that contempt powers may only be exercised when speech presents a clear and present danger to the administration of justice. My remarks pose no such danger. Her tone was not defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was cold truth, wrapped in legal authority. No anger, no defiance, just command. The kind that didn't scream for attention, but demanded respect. It was the voice of someone who had mastered the weight of words, and in that moment, Jasmine spoke not as the accused, but as the law itself. She didn't pause. She didn't wait for a reaction. Instead, with calm precision, she unzipped her leather folder, slowly, methodically, and retrieved a document she had clearly prepared long before this moment. Her fingers were steady as she lifted it. A crisp, neatly printed legal brief, its title unmistakable in bold. Bridges versus California. Full opinion, U.S. Supreme Court. Jasmine held it up with one hand as she spoke again, this time quieter but sharper. And to support that, Your Honor, here is the full opinion from Bridges versus California. She walked the document forward and laid it gently on the clerk's table. Not with force, not with flair, but with finality. It was not a gesture. It was an offering of fact, evidence too precise, too direct to be ignored. The motion was so measured, so intentional, that it felt rehearsed. But it wasn't theater. It was war. And that was Jasmine's first strike. The effect rippled immediately. A rustle moved through the gallery like a chill. Reporters stopped mid-note. Students sat back in stunned silence. Even the court officers along the walls looked subtly toward the bench. It was one thing to argue. It was another to arrive prepared to dismantle a federal judge's threat with cold constitutional precedent. Jasmine had done both in less than 60 seconds. Judge Howell didn't respond right away, and that in itself said more than any verdict. Her face remained stern, but something behind her eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe even hesitation. She leaned forward slowly, like a lion sniffing smoke in its own den, and said, "Don't lecture me on precedent, Congresswoman. I've lived with it my entire career." Her voice was sharp, but it carried something new. A hint of resistance, not dominance. The kind of tone a person uses when they realize they've been challenged. Legitimately, publicly, and with nowhere to run. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood exactly what had just happened. Jasmine Crockett hadn't defended herself. She had taken control. She didn't come to beg for mercy. She came to make it clear. If Howell wanted to swing the gavel, she'd better know what the Constitution actually allowed. And now Howell had a choice. Because for the first time since the hearing began, she wasn't the only authority in the room. She had just been checked, and Jasmine hadn't even raised her voice. The power shift was tangible now. Jasmine had landed a direct legal strike, and the courtroom knew it. But Judge Howell wasn't the type to yield. If anything, being challenged had only sharpened her claws. And instead of backing down, she retaliated, not with law, but with ego. Cold, cutting, personal. Howell let out a soft, scornful laugh. Not amused, disgusted. Her eyes narrowed like she was staring at something beneath her. Then, with venom laced in every syllable, she fired back. You're just cherry-picking a few cases to show off, like some over-eager law student trying to impress her professors. This is federal court, not your political stage. The tone wasn't judicial, it was condescending. Her words weren't about legal precedent anymore. They were about stripping Jasmine of legitimacy, reducing her to a poseur in a room she didn't deserve to speak in. Then Howell's voice dropped, each word more deliberate, more threatening than the last. Unless you apologize right now, maybe a few days in a jail. Cell will teach you what humility really means. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't shock, it was disbelief. A sitting member of Congress had just been told she might be jailed for refusing to bow to pride, disguised as protocol. It wasn't about contempt anymore. It was about control. And yet, Jasmine didn't even blink. She calmly unzipped her folder, fingers precise, steady, unaffected. She pulled out a single page, already clipped and highlighted, like she knew this exact moment would come. Holding it between two fingers, she stepped forward, her tone razor-sharp and ice-cold. Here is the full transcript of my statement, Your Honor. As you can see, I opened by clearly stating my respect for the authority of this court. There was no anger in her voice, no mockery, just brutal clarity. The clerk took the paper, but it was the words on that paper that landed the blow. At the very top, in black and white, it read, "While I respect the authority of the court, today's ruling appears to disregard established precedent on protected political speech." That sentence changed everything. She hadn't disrespected the court. She had done the opposite. She had shown respect before expressing a measured, constitutionally grounded concern. No grandstanding, no rebellion, just lawful, protected commentary. And now it was in the record, indisputable. Jasmine hadn't just rejected the accusation. She had disproved it, line for line. In a moment designed to humiliate her, she'd chosen not to react emotionally. She'd chosen evidence. And in this courtroom, evidence carried more weight than outrage. But Jasmine wasn't here just to stay standing. She was here to fight back, with facts, with precision, and with the law. Judge Howell had already thrown threats, mockery, and the threat of jail at her, trying to break her down. But Jasmine didn't fold. She didn't shout, didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly prepared her next move, and it hit harder than anything that had come before. She reached into her folder again, hands steady, and pulled out two more documents. They were neatly printed, with color tabs marking the key sections. She didn't wave them around. She didn't need to. Jasmine placed the papers carefully on the clerk's desk, like laying down cards in a game she already knew she was winning. Her voice stayed calm and steady, but her words carried weight. In Landmark Communications versus Virginia, the Supreme Court made it clear, public discussion of judicial conduct, even by those outside the court, is protected speech under the First Amendment. She didn't just quote the law, she owned it. She was showing everyone in the room, especially Howell, that she came fully prepared. The room reacted before the judge did. Reporters sat up straighter. Law students leaned forward, some of them scribbling notes as fast as they could. Everyone knew what they were seeing wasn't normal. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was teaching a masterclass in constitutional law, right in the middle of a courtroom meant to intimidate her. And then came the second strike. Jasmine picked up the next document and with the same steady tone said, "In addition, the Ninth Circuit held in Standing Committee vs. Yagman that an attorney's criticism of a judge is constitutionally protected unless it's both objectively and subjectively false." She laid that ruling beside the first one, side by side, two pillars of legal truth. Then she looked directly at Judge Howell again and said clearly and without hesitation, "My comments were neither false nor were they attacks. They were legal observations about consistency and constitutional application." That final sentence hit like a punch behind velvet gloves. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Everyone heard what she was really saying. This isn't about disrespect. It's about rights. And I know mine. The silence in the room grew deeper. Jasmine wasn't stalling for time. She wasn't trying to save face. She was taking control of the entire situation. Through logic, evidence, and the full weight of legal precedent. This wasn't about emotion anymore. It was strategy, pure and focused. The judge said nothing, but it was clear something had changed. The atmosphere that once belonged completely to Howell was now shifting. People weren't just watching Jasmine anymore. They were listening to her. Every word, every ruling she cited, every fact she laid down. The room was moving with her now. And even though Judge Howell still sat higher on the bench, that sense of control, the air of untouchable power, was slipping. Jasmine hadn't begged for respect. She had taken it, not by yelling, not by posturing, but by using the only thing more powerful than a judge's tone, the Constitution itself. And just when the balance seemed to tilt toward chaos, Jasmine didn't flinch. She rose. "Enough!" Judge Howell roared, her voice bouncing off the marble walls like a cannon blast. She slammed her palm on the bench, eyes blazing, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. "You think a few dusty case files make you untouchable? This is my courtroom. I decide what stands and what gets thrown out." Papers rustled from the blow. A gasp spread through the gallery. The room was no longer just tense. It was explosive. But Howell wasn't finished. Her fury twisted sharper, personal. She leaned forward, snarling, "You're nothing more than a publicity-hungry politician. The law isn't your stage, and this isn't your campaign rally." The words hit like daggers, meant to humiliate. Every syllable dripping with contempt, as if Jasmine's presence in that room was a disgrace to the law itself. This wasn't judicial order. It was a verbal assault. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She stood tall, shoulders square, breath steady, and eyes locked onto Howell like she had all the time in the world. No panic, no reaction, only presence. Then, silent as a blade, she reached into her folder and retrieved one thick document, labeled Exhibit 4, and held it up with calm precision. She turned to the clerk first, handed it over, and then looked Howell dead in the eye. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but poised, "I submit Exhibit 4. She didn't pause. Her voice, now louder, cut through the air like a scalpel. "This is not opinion. It's not speculation. It's documented legal fact. The first section contains a list of every lawsuit in which I successfully challenged abuse of judicial contempt powers. Each one filed, tried, and won. You'll find the case numbers, the courts, the rulings, federal, state, appellate. Each victory, marked by overreach, struck down and boundaries restored." She stepped forward, her tone tightening like a wire. "And the second section?" She tapped the file. "That's a legal study, written by me, titled The Elastic Boundaries of Contempt, Re-Examining Power in the American Courtroom. It's peer-reviewed, cited in national journals, published in the Columbia Law Review, reprinted by Georgetown's Law and Justice Digest. Not a puff piece, a legal landmark, built on data, scholarship, and precedent. And yes, Your Honor, on lived experience." The silence afterward wasn't emptiness. It was thunder held in a clenched fist. Howell stared at the exhibit, her hands motionless now. The rage that just moments ago lit her face like fire had faltered. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the front page. And then, just for a second, her brow furrowed, not with anger, with uncertainty, with calculation. It was the first crack in her armor, and everyone saw it. The room had changed. No one dared move. Not the aides, not the reporters, not the bailiff. Everyone locked onto the quiet war playing out between a judge used to crushing dissent and a woman who just wouldn't bow. Because Jasmine Crockett had just done what few ever could. She didn't shout back. She didn't retreat. She brought the law and let it speak louder than any insult. And for the first time, Judge Howell had no immediate retort. Only silence, a silence that spoke volumes. But even cornered, Judge Howell wasn't ready to surrender. She made one final move, sharp, legal, desperate. Her voice cut through the tense air like a blade. "All your theories mean nothing if this court finds your speech disruptive." The words echoed louder than their volume. They carried the weight of a judge trying to regain control, not through fairness, but force. Every syllable dripped with condescension, cloaked as legal authority. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a threat disguised as protocol. A last attempt to silence Jasmine not by logic, but by labeling her voice a problem. The room bristled. For a brief second, time seemed suspended. No one moved. No one breathed. It was the kind of moment where some people flinch, some retreat. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her hands were steady, almost graceful, as she reached into her folder. No rush, no theatrics, just quiet, calculated certainty. She pulled out a thin, clear plastic binder, aged slightly at the corners. Inside was a single printed document, a federal ruling from 2019. The author? Chief Judge Beryl Howell herself. Jasmine stepped forward with unshakable calm. She placed the document gently on the evidence table, face up, neatly aligned. Then she turned to the judge and spoke with unshakable clarity. "Your Honor," she said, "this is Exhibit 5, the official ruling issued in 2019 by you." The courtroom gasped before their minds could even process why, and then the weight of it hit them. "This isn't opinion. This is your own precedent," Jasmine continued, voice controlled but piercing. "In that ruling, you wrote, and I quote, 'Cautious criticism of judicial decisions rarely rises to the level of contempt.'" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Shock, recognition, and awe exploding beneath it. "Your Honor, I'm not challenging the court's authority. I'm invoking its own logic." That was the moment the entire courtroom detonated, not in noise, but in energy. Gasps spread like wildfire. Reporters jolted into motion. Keyboards clattered, cameras zoomed in, and pens scratched furiously across notepads. The clerk froze mid-sentence. Aides exchanged frantic looks. The very air in the room had changed, from charged to electric, from control to collapse. Because what Jasmine had just done wasn't merely clever, it was legally lethal. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had simply held up a mirror, and in it, Howell was forced to see herself, the very standard she was now attempting to deny. Jasmine had neutralized the threat not with volume, but with precision, not with rage, but with evidence, and not with speculation, but with the judge's own words, written under her own seal, just 6 years prior. The quote was surgical in its aim. Howell stared down at the document like it was a ghost from her past come to testify. Her eyes scanned the first line, then froze on the paragraph Jasmine quoted. Her own name in the header, her own signature on the final page, her own philosophy now weaponized against her in the exact scenario she had once ruled on. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her jaw tensed, but no strength followed. Her robe, once a symbol of power, now looked like a shield that had cracked. She was exposed, and she knew it. This wasn't a courtroom moment, it was a takedown. The silence stretched, but not because anyone doubted what had happened. Everyone knew exactly what this meant. Jasmine hadn't just parried Howell's strike, she'd inverted the power dynamic. Howell had tried to trap her in contempt law. Jasmine had shown that she'd already walked that terrain, studied every corner of it, and mastered it, long before Howell ever tried to weaponize it against her. And more devastatingly, Howell had already agreed with Jasmine, in writing, on record, for the entire legal world to see. This was no coincidence. It was strategy, calculated, timed, airtight. Howell sat motionless, caught in her own precedent, unable to argue without contradicting her own legal identity. Her authority had been hollowed out in public view, not by insult, but by integrity. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She simply stood tall, her silence now louder than anything Howell could ever say. It was, in every way, the point of no return. The moment Jasmine finished reading Howell's own 2019 ruling aloud, the entire courtroom felt like it had lost oxygen. The silence was thick, alive, dangerous. And somewhere in that stillness, power shifted hands. Judge Howell blinked, her jaw tightening just slightly. Not in control, but in resistance. The bench that once elevated her now felt like a spotlighted stage, and the eyes of a nation were on her. She looked down, not at Jasmine, not at the audience, but at the wooden desk, almost as if the grain of the wood could offer an escape hatch. But there was no out. She'd been cornered not by an insult, not by rage, but by her own words methodically retrieved, exposed, and re-weaponized by the one person she'd underestimated most. She reached for the gavel with stiff fingers, her hand moving as if through molasses. For a moment, it didn't land with its usual piercing confidence. Instead, it sounded hollow, measured, begrudging. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she said, each word dragged out like a reluctant confession. The court stenographer looked up, briefly confused. That wasn't the plan. That wasn't the tone. But no one moved to question her, not today. The judge stood, stiff and slow, and turned toward her private chambers. No dramatic swirl of the robe, no final glance at Jasmine. She simply walked, shoulders lower, posture tighter, as if the black fabric now clung to her like lead. The double doors behind the bench closed with a soft click, and the room finally exhaled. And then it erupted. Reporters scrambled like they'd been shot from cannons. Phones flew up. Thumbs typed furiously. One anchor whispered into a collar mic, "Confirming now, Judge Howell cited in reversal. Yes, it's her own 2019 ruling. Crockett used it. Judge called recess." Others were already filming short recaps, microphones aimed at lips. Every journalist in that room knew what had just occurred wasn't normal. It wasn't procedural. It was historical. In the fourth row, a retired legal columnist turned to her assistant. "You don't understand," she said, almost breathless. "This never happens. A judge getting boxed in like that by a congresswoman? Using her own precedent? That's not just a power shift, that's a takedown." Behind them, two political analysts whispered, "This will be on every Sunday morning panel for the next month." Howell just blinked, and everyone saw it. Near the back, an ethics professor shook his head. "It's like watching Goliath drop his own sword." And in the front, Jasmine Crockett sat silent, still, composed. But make no mistake, this was the eye of the storm she had summoned. Her shoulders didn't move, her fingers didn't twitch, but her presence had changed. No longer a defendant, no longer just a witness. Now she was the one whose evidence had bent the system without even raising her voice, and in that silence, her restraint screamed louder than any microphone could. 15 minutes passed in waves, every second thick with echo and energy. Even the marble walls seemed to hold their breath. Some of Howell's aides returned before she did, their faces pale, their hands clutching tablets. No one spoke above a whisper. Not anymore. Because this wasn't just about a courtroom anymore. This was about a public reckoning. Finally, at minute 16, the heavy doors creaked open again. Judge Howell re-entered slowly, methodically, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting it to look different. It didn't, but what had changed was the air itself. She walked back to the bench, her black robe swaying like a shadow behind her. She no longer held the gavel like a sword. She placed it down like it was porcelain, fragile, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. The courtroom was still. Even the sound tech stopped breathing. Then Howell looked up, her voice low but clear, words chosen like stepping on glass. "This court," she said, "will review the submitted materials in greater detail." A pause, a hesitation, and then came the line that no one in that room, thought they'd hear from her. "The prior contempt warning is withdrawn." That was it. 8 words, but they detonated like dynamite in silence. No one cheered, no one gasped, not out loud, but the shock was nuclear. Journalists froze mid-keystroke. Aides looked up like they'd misheard. One law student whispered, "She backed down. Did she just reverse herself?" The legal counsel seated behind Jasmine dropped his pen, not out of surprise but out of sheer disbelief that it had actually worked. It was more than just a victory. It was a rare, raw surrender, quiet, undressed, and undeniable. Howell had withdrawn her own threat, not due to pressure, not from fear, but because she had been cornered by evidence so surgical, so devastating, it removed her only remaining escape: denial. And Jasmine, she didn't move, didn't flinch. Her calm was not arrogance. It was proof. She had brought the fire to the courtroom, but she had never raised her voice to do it. She had simply prepared, waited, struck once, and let the law do the rest. Across the aisle, a defense attorney leaned over to his colleague and muttered, "That wasn't just a legal defense. That was a public lesson in judicial restraint." Jasmine looked straight ahead, not to the cameras, not to the reporters, but to the bench where, just minutes ago, she'd been warned, belittled, threatened. Now that same bench had reversed itself. The power in the room had shifted, and no one could pretend otherwise. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't just survived the courtroom. She had owned it. And just as the echo of the withdrawn warning faded, a new tension rose. Quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Judge Howell straightened in her chair, the weight in her posture replaced by something cooler and more precise. Her eyes moved from the bench to the counsel tables, then to Jasmine, then back again. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, and stripped of the bite it carried earlier. "The court has considered the posture of the record," she said, each word paced like a step across thin ice. Then she pivoted, eyes settling on Jasmine, with a steadiness that surprised everyone. "Would counsel have any objection to Congresswoman Crockett submitting an independent legal analysis, a friend of the court amicus brief, for the court's consideration in the principal matter?" No one breathed. The sentence hung in the air like a live wire, humming with risk and revelation. This was the same judge who moments ago had threatened a cell, now floating an invitation. She turned toward the government's table with a slight nod that carried expectation, not command. The lead prosecutor, who had been stone still, leaned to whisper with a colleague, eyes darting back to Jasmine as if measuring the weather. Then he rose, buttoned his jacket, and faced the bench. "No objection from the government, Your Honor," he said, voice tight but clear, "provided the government has an opportunity to respond in due course." Howell gave a crisp nod, neither pleased nor displeased, only exact. Her gaze swept to the defense table, where counsel was already halfway out of his chair. He didn't need to confer. Not now. "No objection from the defense, Your Honor," he said, almost before the judge could finish looking his way. "We welcome the submission." The words landed like a door quietly opening. The gallery reacted in waves, not noise. A shock rolling from row to row, faces tilting, eyes widening, pens stuttering over paper. Reporters weren't just writing, they were recalibrating headlines in real time. A minute ago, the story was bare-knuckle confrontation. Now it was an invitation to advise the court. The contradiction felt cinematic, and yet it was happening in the clearest daylight. Even the court officers along the wall shifted their weight, as if the floor itself had moved under them. Jasmine stood where she was, feet planted, shoulders level, expression steady. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't glow or gloat. The power of the moment was not in volume, it was in gravity. She allowed the silence to do its work, to let the idea of her as a source of guidance, not a target, sink into every seat in the room. The very air seemed to slow, waiting for the next syllable from the bench. Howell glanced to the clerk, then back to the counsel tables, the choreography more intentional than before. There was no sarcasm in her tone, not a trace of it, only a judicial cadence that sounded newly vigilant. "The court will accept the filing if submitted," she added, as if sealing a fragile pact with careful hands. A beat passed and she addressed both sides again, equal measure. "The record will reflect the parties' consent." A law student in the back whispered, "Did that just happen?" And his friend nudged him silent, eyes locked forward. In the press row, a television producer mouthed to her cameraman, stay wide, this is the shot." A veteran columnist scribbled 3 words in the margin of her notepad, from threat to trust, and underlined them twice. People were used to judges asking for clarity from counsel. They were not used to judges inviting analysis from someone they'd nearly sanctioned. The shift felt like watching a storm reverse direction in a single gust. At the government's table, the prosecutor kept his chin up, but his fingers worried the edge of his legal pad. He had agreed, and he knew why. Declining would have looked petty against the record they just heard. Across from him, defense counsel finally let his shoulders drop half an inch, the first sign of ease since morning. He wasn't smiling, but the fight in his posture had changed shapes. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. And in that strategy, the defense could see daylight. Howell's tone stayed even, but the room could hear what had fallen away. The acid, the edge, the bite that had turned questions into cuts. What replaced it was structure, an architecture of procedure built in real time to hold something fragile and necessary: credibility. The bench was not apologizing, benches rarely do, but it was building a bridge back to the law, plank by careful plank, and inviting everyone to walk it together. That is what the words amicus brief did here. They turned heat into light and argument into analysis. For those who needed the translation, the meaning was simple enough. An amicus brief isn't a favor. It's a formal submission from a non-party, a friend of the court, offering independent legal reasoning. It is not advocacy for the defendant or the government. It is advocacy for the law itself. By floating the idea, the judge reframed the battle from personal to principled. She took the energy that had threatened to break the room and redirected it into a structured channel. The invitation said, "Help me think, not help me win." But the shock in the gallery wasn't about rules. It was about reversal. Minutes ago, a cell had been on the table. Now a written analysis was being requested from the same person who had stood facing custody. People aren't used to watching institutions turn on a hinge that fast. It rattled them. The speed, the starkness, the sudden exchange of heat for logic. And yet it felt right in the bones, the way a falling object finally stops fighting gravity and lands where it belongs. Howell's face gave away nothing, but the room had learned to read the smaller tells. The steadier breathing, the unhurried diction, the absence of the earlier hunt in her eyes. This wasn't capitulation. It was recalibration. She was not surrendering her authority. She was exercising it differently. She was saying, without saying it, "We will do this by the book." In a courtroom, that promise matters more than pride. A reporter near the aisle whispered into her phone, "New angle. Judge invites Congresswoman's legal analysis. Both sides consent." Another replied, "Spell out amicus. Viewers will need it." The court artist's charcoal paused at the edge of the page, then started again, lines softer now around the judge's eyes. This wasn't a smile, it was clarity. That alone was startling enough to draw. Jasmine remained composed, neither bowing to the bench nor bristling against it. Her calm became the room's metronome. Steady, quiet, exact. She didn't need to perform surprise. The evidence had already done that for her. What she held now was posture, a presence that said she could hold the weight of invitation without letting it bend her shape. The gallery saw it and understood. Dignity doesn't raise its voice. When the murmurs finally thinned, the room settled into a new alignment. The judge had spoken the words that changed the temperature. The parties had agreed, and the chamber had absorbed the shock. Nothing else needed to happen in that moment. The shift had already done its work. From the front row to the last, people felt it in their chests. This was what a turning point looks like before anyone names it. The clock still ticked. The flag still hung, but the ground beneath them was, undeniably, new. The courtroom doors hadn't even cooled when the story exploded into the world. Newsrooms lit up like switchboards in a storm. Assignment editors barked orders, producers yelled for clips, and lower thirds burned across screens. From contempt to collaboration, digital desks pushed breaking alerts to millions of phones in minutes. Copy editors tightened headlines with a razor. Judge reverses course, invites brief from the woman she almost jailed. On live broadcasts, anchors leaned forward and slowed their cadence, treating the footage like an artifact. Watch the exact moment the judge pivots, from sanction to solicitation. By nightfall, the phrase had stuck to the story like a signature, from contempt to collaboration. Inside one national newsroom, the arguments went fast and surgical. "Lead with a reversal," an executive producer said, stabbing a finger at the rundown. "Then roll the quote about the amicus brief. People need to hear the language." A print editor countered, "No, lead with the contrast, the threat of jail versus the invitation to advise." The managing editor cut them off. "We're doing all of it, side-by-side lower thirds, timeline bar, and a pull quote box." On cue, the switcher fired the split screen. The judge's stern face on the left, the words amicus brief highlighted on the right. The control room went quiet for half a second, the kind of silence that follows a clean hit. Clips hit social media in tight, lethal cuts. 90 seconds of courtroom audio, synced with captions, spread through legal Twitter like a brush fire. One clip captured the bench's exact wording, another stitched the invite to the prosecutor's "no objection," and the defense's "we welcome the submission." Lawyers quote tweeted with short, dry verdicts. That's not spin, that's a pivot. Civic groups added their own text. When power listens to law. By dawn, the framing had hardened into a chorus, from contempt to collaboration. Then came the long forms, the anatomies, the frame-by-frame dissections, the slow-motion explainers. Legal reporters mapped the sequence across a minute-by-minute bar: threat, evidence, withdrawal, invitation. Explainer graphics turned the courtroom into a schematic: bench, counsel tables, podium, gallery, arrows showing where the energy had moved. One national magazine ran the headline, "How a Single Exhibit Redrew the Map of a Hearing." Podcasts held emergency tapings, heaving open the doctrine of contempt powers for the lay audience. By the time the sun rose, the story had a spine, and the public could feel the bones of it. Law schools moved with startling speed. Deans sent department-wide emails before office hours. "We will review this footage in constitutional law and professional responsibility." Syllabi were amended in real time. Week 9 now read contempt, critique, and judicial restraint. Case study, Howell Crockett. Librarians pulled transcripts, cataloged time codes, and posted a central resource page. In student lounges, the video looped without sound as clusters formed around laptops. It looked like students watching a big game replay, except the scoreboard measured composure, not touchdowns. In a packed lecture hall, a professor froze the screen at the pivotal frame. The subtitle read, "The prior contempt warning is withdrawn." Chalk squeaked under the words "clear" and "present danger," landmark, Yagman, and amicus. "Listen to the tone," the professor said. "Authority speaks two ways, as control or as custody. Today it chose custody. Custody of the law." Pens clattered and a single hand went up. "Is this what judicial humility looks like?" The professor smiled without softness. "It's what it sounds like." Clinics snapped to it, too. One appellate program built an assignment overnight: draft an amicus outline based on the public record and prepare a 5-minute oral preview. Another clinic staged a live workshop. One student played the bench, 2 played counsel, 1 played the invited amicus. Every phrase timed, every citation forced to earn its place. In the professional responsibility seminar, the prompt was brutal and clean. Write the version of that invitation that still holds if you're wrong in public. The room didn't laugh. It worked. By the end of the hour, drafts covered desks like blueprints. Faculty listservs hummed with a rare collective electricity. A con law chair wrote, "The teachable moment isn't the reversal. It's the mechanism of it." A trial advocacy director replied, "Watch the breath patterns. Credibility has a cadence." An ethics scholar added, "We don't punish daylight, we use it." On another campus, a dean requested permission to run the clip in orientation for first years. "Let them see the shape of courage," she wrote, "and the shape, of course, correction." Beyond the campuses, the machinery of the judiciary started to turn. The Judicial Conference of the United States issued a terse notice. 3 paragraphs, no adjectives. It announced the formation of a special committee to review standards for invoking contempt, with particular attention to public commentary by officials and attorneys. No fanfare, no press theatrics. Just the tight language of an institution choosing to clip and sand one of its sharpest tools. The charter spelled its aim: clarify thresholds, emphasize non-punitive alternatives, recommend training modules. Even the date felt deliberate, like a timestamp on an airlock. Inside the committee, the agenda was all steel. Item 1, define disruption with evidence, not impression. Item 2, separate disrespect from critique with operational criteria judges can apply under pressure. Item 3, build model bench statements for moments when heat outruns light, each script paired with a de-escalation path. Item 4, Direct the Federal Judicial Center to incorporate scenario-based modules on contempt restraint. Not theory, not platitudes, drills. Judges would practice the very pivot the nation had just watched. The Federal Judicial Center moved on its marching orders with the quiet speed of a well-run shop. Curriculum designers drafted a half-day program: contempt, doctrine, discipline, de-escalation. Segment A, doctrine refresh with live hypotheticals. Segment B, role play under time pressure with a coaching bench behind the bench. Segment C, language lab, replacing reflex with reasoning. The closing segment featured one line in bold: power is loud, credibility is quiet. Registration filled in hours. Courts began asking for bench cards, a pocket-sized script for the hardest 10 seconds. The working draft offered phrases like, "The court recognizes the gravity of the comment and invites counsel to submit it in writing." Another card underlined a simple path: restate, request, recess. Restate the standard. Request the authority. Recess if needed. It looked basic until you realized it had saved an entire courtroom from the edge a few days earlier. Practice hardened the muscle. Newsrooms tracked those ripple effects with a stunned, almost reverent efficiency. One national daily ran a Sunday centerpiece titled, "When the Gavel Pauses, the New Contempt Conversation." It boxed out 3 quotes, one from a retired judge, one from a clinical professor, one from a public defender. The retired judge said, "Bench discipline is a learned skill. We learned something this week." The professor said, "If you can redirect confrontation into collaboration, you're not yielding, you're governing." The defender said, "We've been waiting for this language our whole careers." Through it all, the footage kept traveling. City councils used it in open meeting trainings to show how authority can pivot without collapsing. Corporate compliance teams used it to model tone in internal investigations. Even journalism schools screened the sequence to teach how to script a turning point without hyping it into fiction. The clip had no special effects, no music bed, no slow zoom, just a room, a decision, and the sound of power learning out loud. It was more compelling than a trailer because it was true. Then came the invitations, to panels, to bar conferences, to bench bar dialogues with titles that read like case notes. Judge Howell began to accept them. Not all, not quickly, but enough to mark a change. She took a seat at tables where the name cards were heavy and the questions heavier. On stage, the lights were clean and unforgiving, the microphones hot, the eyes of peers focused like lenses trained on an X-ray. She opened with no flourish. "I will speak about one thing: limits." Halls fell quiet when she began. "There is nothing weak about a pause," she said. "There is, in fact, nothing stronger." She talked about the contour of authority, the thin seam where control can suffocate clarity, and the cost of crossing it. "Humility is not the absence of power," she continued. "It is the discipline to use less than you have." The line did not seek applause, and it didn't get any. It got something else: note-taking. During Q&A, the hands did not tremble. A practitioner asked how to sense when the temperature is running ahead of the facts. "Listen for speed in your own voice," Howell said. "When it outruns your analysis, call a recess." A judge from another circuit asked what she did with the sting of being corrected in public. Howell did not blink. "I put it in the record," she said. "That is where it belongs." The headlines adjusted again, not rewriting the past but widening it. From contempt to collaboration remained the banner, but the subheads matured. How an invitation became a blueprint. Training the pause. The bench learns out loud. Opinion writers resisted the easy arc of heroes and villains and aimed for something harder, a narrative of systems that can self-correct when people choose to. The pieces were not soft. They were specific. They named the doctrine, the steps, the words. Law reviews announced symposia with crisp themes: contempt thresholds, institutional speech, and the ethics of reconsideration. Panels paired judges with journalists, scholars with public defenders, trial lawyers with appellate theorists. The goal wasn't to celebrate a single moment. It was to turn that moment into a method. In corridors between sessions, conversations took on the sound of a shop floor, people comparing tools, not trophies. "We can build with this. one judge said, and another answered, then let's. Back on campuses, students kept watching the clip with the volume off, timing the beats, threat, evidence, withdrawal, invitation. You could chart it on a whiteboard, but you could also feel it in your sternum, the thud of a room choosing sense over spectacle. A professor ended class with a quiet instruction. When the chance comes to trade heat for light, you take it. No one packed their bags until the screen went black. In living rooms and break rooms, the story traveled on word of mouth, the old-fashioned way. Did you see that judge? Someone would ask, and the answer would come, yeah, the one who pulled back. It wasn't gossip, it was relief. The country had watched a power structure flex and not break, adjust and not excuse, invite and not retreat. For once, the clips did not leave the audience angrier. They left them steadier. The institutions were still human, but the humans had chosen the institution. By week's end, the phrase had crossed from headline to shorthand. From contempt to collaboration wasn't just a recap, it was a route. It described a turn that others could practice. From threat to standard, from posture to proof, from pride to process. None of it made the law softer, it made it stronger. And for a public starved for competence, it looked like oxygen. In the quiet after the rush, the clip kept doing what good records do. It stayed. On servers, in syllabi, in training decks, in the marrow of 1,000 conversations. The judge's voice was the same in every playback. Cooler now, careful, precise. The court will review the submitted materials in greater detail. The prior contempt warning is withdrawn. Those words had not just reversed a course, they had opened one. And the country, for once, seemed ready to walk it. The headlines had cooled. The think pieces had run their course. But the story hadn't died. It had deepened, settling into the bones of the profession like a new rhythm that refused to fade. 6 months later, Columbia Law School's largest auditorium pulsed with a quiet, electric anticipation. The stage lights cut clean lines across a darkened crowd. Students, professors, judges, reporters, and a few faces who had sat in that courtroom row months ago, now here to watch the aftershock become a conversation. The backdrop was sober. Wood paneling, a blue banner, 2 chairs, 1 narrow table between them, and microphones that hummed with the breath of a full house. Phones were silenced, but not forgotten. Their cameras waited like patient sentries. Security stood easy at the exits, hands clasped, eyes alert. A hush fell when the doors at stage right opened. Judge Beryl Howell walked out first, measured and straight-backed, her expression controlled but not cold. A soft ripple moved through the room, a private acknowledgement shared by people who recognize a face from 1,000 screens. She did not scan the audience. She looked only at the chair where she would sit, then at the microphone that would carry her voice. Moments later, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the same light, steady and composed, a deliberate presence rather than a performance. She did not glance at the media row or the front bench soaked in faculty authority. She looked once at Howell, nodded, and took her seat. The moderator, a professor whose casebooks lined the shelves of every second-year student in the room, kept the introduction short. "We are here," he said, "to talk about power, responsibility, and what happens when the two collide in public." He explained the format, brief opening thoughts, followed by questions. No theatrics, no ambushes. Then he leaned back, turned slightly toward the bench and said, "Judge Howell, if you're willing, start us where you are now." The house was quiet enough to hear the air conditioning. Howell folded her hands, exhaled once, and spoke. "The goal of justice is not to assert authority, but to reach fair judgments." She let the sentence stand on its own feet, not rushing the silence that followed. The line was plain, almost blunt, and yet it carried the ring of something hammered clean by heat. Heads tipped forward as pens met paper. Even the students who had walked in to watch a fight found themselves listening for something else. Craft, standard, the sound of a course correction. Howell continued in an even tone. "We speak with force when we must, but force without patience can become theater, and theater has no place where law is supposed to breathe." She didn't relive the incident. She recentered the principle. She spoke about thresholds, about the difference between noise and disruption, and about the discipline of recognizing that a raised voice is often a symptom of a lowered standard. She did not apologize with adjectives. She recalibrated with nouns. Bench discipline is not about refusing to act, she said. It is about acting only when the standard is met, and saying so when it is not. The line landed not as confession, but as instruction. A few in the front row underlined it twice. The moderator turned to Jasmine. "Congresswoman Crockett?" She didn't shift her posture or adjust the mic. She simply met the room with the same stillness that had changed the courtroom's air months ago. When you know the law is on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. The Constitution is loud enough on its own. The words didn't snap. They settled, like a heavy coin dropped into a still bowl. People weren't struck by what she said as much as by how she said it. Without heat, without performance. A clean blade resting in plain sight. Jasmine spoke about preparation as a kind of composure, the way knowing the doctrine prevents panic from steering the moment. She explained that criticism of a court, when grounded in precedent and made without malice, is not a fire, but a tool. "We lose nothing," she said, "by naming the limits of contempt. We gain trust." She did not recount the confrontation. She dissected the mechanics of a constitutional boundary and the cost of ignoring it. "Respect is not silence," she added. "It is accuracy." The auditorium absorbed the sentence like a reminder they'd been waiting to hear put exactly that way. The first question came from a third-year student near the aisle, nervous but steady. "Judge, how do you know, in real time, when to take a recess?" The room leaned into the practical. Howell didn't change her expression. "Listen for speed," she answered. "When your voice outruns your analysis, you're not judging, you're reacting. A recess is not a retreat. It is a tool to restore ratios, time to temperature, patience to pressure, standard to spectacle." The student nodded as if someone had just attached a handle to a door he'd been trying to push open with his shoulder. A public defender raised a hand next. "Congresswoman, what do you tell young lawyers who are afraid that firm criticism will be taken as disrespect?" Jasmine answered without softening her tone. "First, check your facts, then check your motive, then check your volume." A faint ripple of laughter eased the room before she finished. "If all three hold, speak. If any one of them doesn't, write." She paused, letting the crowd finish writing. "The court needs honesty. It does not need noise." Heads bobbed across the theater. A clinical professor asked about the formal invitation, how an amicus brief changed the atmosphere, and whether the shift felt like a prize or a burden. Howell spoke first, precise as a blueprint. "An amicus is oxygen," she said. "It opens a window when a room runs out of air." She described the difference between advocacy and analysis, how one pushes from a side and the other presses on the standard from the center. Jasmine nodded once, then added, "It is not a trophy. It is an obligation to the law, not to either party." The line earned a few soft taps on laptop keys. Midway through, the moderator trimmed the sails of the conversation and steered into doctrine. "We've seen the phrase clear and present danger misused as a shortcut," he said. "How do you keep it honest?" Howell answered, "With facts, not impressions." She described a simple test. If the record can't show how the speech threatens the proceeding, immediacy is an illusion, not a threshold. "We are not guarding our pride," she said. "We are guarding process." The room relaxed into the clarity. Then came a question the room felt coming. A young associate from a white shoe firm, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. "Judge, how do you carry being corrected in public?" There was no edge in his voice, only clinical curiosity. Howell didn't blink. "In a record," she said, "where it belongs." She explained that the transcript is not a diary. It is a ledger, and accuracy is its only currency. "Pain doesn't diminish truth," she added. "It simply tests whether we will honor it." The associate's pen paused in midair, then kept going. A journalist asked Jasmine about restraint. "Did you ever want to raise your voice?" Jasmine didn't smile. "Wanting is not the metric," she said. "Standards are." She explained that anger is a signal, not a strategy, and that the fastest way to lose a point is to outshout it. "Brevity isn't weakness," she said. "It is a form of strength when your sources carry the weight." The journalist lowered her phone. satisfied not with a quote to cut, but with a sentence to keep. As the hour glassed toward its end, the moderator asked both speakers to leave the room with one sentence, a tool a listener could carry from the auditorium to the next hard moment. Howell went first. She looked down at her notes and then away from them. The goal of justice is not to assert authority, but to reach fair judgments. She didn't underline the words with volume. She underlined them with pace. The audience didn't clap. It wrote. Quiet filled the gaps like mortar. Jasmine followed, neither faster nor slower than before. When you know the law is on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. The Constitution is loud enough on its own. A few students looked up from their notebooks at the exact same second, as if something had snapped into alignment behind their eyes. A defense attorney closed his legal pad and didn't open it again. A retired judge in the back row nodded once. No more. The moderator thanked them both, but the thanks felt small next to the room's collective exhale. The Q&A ended, but the learning did not. In the mezzanine, clusters formed that looked less like fans and more like crews around a workbench, assembling language, testing phrases against imagined heat. Recess as a tool, someone said, as if naming a new instrument in a kit. Standards over pride, another murmured, anchoring a line for the next brief she would write. A professor told a reporter, "The point isn't that a judge changed her mind, it's that the system remembered how." The reporter didn't nod, he just wrote it down. Down front, a first-year student lingered, knuckles white on a backpack strap. He waited until the aisle cleared and then approached the edge of the stage. "How do you hold your ground without hardening your heart?" he asked, voice low, eyes bright. Howell answered first, "By choosing standards you can carry and live with." Jasmine added, "By knowing your sources well enough that you don't need to armor your tone." The student swallowed and said, "Thank you." He didn't ask for a photo. He didn't need one. Outside, the late afternoon had turned the campus stone to bronze. The banners on College Walk moved softly in the wind, not triumphal, just steady. Reporters peeled away toward the gates, walking as they typed. Professors clustered into smaller conversations that would become assignments by morning. Students called friends and tried to explain the feeling of watching two people refuse pettiness and choose something harder. No one dramatized what had happened. It didn't need it. Back inside the auditorium, the AV team powered down the mics and folded the chairs with the quiet efficiency of people who have watched 100 events and can tell when one will last. On the stage, 2 water glasses remained, half empty, the rims bright under the work lights. A single index card sat forgotten near the moderator's chair. One word written in block capitals, humility. A technician picked it up and slid it into the program binder without comment. The room, finally empty, kept its own counsel. The moment didn't end with applause because applause would have made it smaller. It ended with a kind of grounded silence, the kind that follows a decision, not a spectacle. The story that began in a courtroom had crossed a harder distance than headlines can track. It had moved from confrontation to instruction, from pressure to practice, from heat to standard. And in that crossing, it left a tool anyone could carry. Knowledge, composure, truth. Those weren't slogans today. They were choices made one sentence at a time, under lights that allow no hiding. They beat arrogance, not with spectacle, but with steadiness. They beat blind power by refusing to perform weakness. And as the campus settled into evening, the lesson held. Clear, heavy, simple. When the law is enough, the volume can stay low. And from that silence, one final truth rises. What happened in that courtroom isn't just a story, it's a call. This isn't about watching power bend for a single afternoon. It's about what happens when ordinary people demand the same discipline from every bench, every chamber, every leader who claims authority. You don't need a robe or a title to stand on principle. You need preparation, clarity, and the will to stay steady when the room turns hostile. Justice doesn't protect itself. It waits for people willing to name the standard out loud. That's where you come in. So ask yourself, where are the rooms in your own life that need light instead of heat? Maybe it's a workplace drowning in noise, a community argument burning without resolution, or a policy fight where no one wants to say the hard truth. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for calm. Bring the precedent, bring the evidence, Bring the composure. Like Jasmine showed, the law or the principle already speaks loud enough. All it needs is someone willing to hold it steady. And here's the charge. Don't let this be just another clip you scroll past, another story you tell once and forget. Turn it into a practice. When arrogance tries to crush truth, meet it with facts. When power tries to intimidate, meet it with patience sharpened into steel. When the room wants theater, insist on standards. Write it, speak it, carry it. Because the next turning point won't come in a marble courtroom. It will come where you are, when the pressure hits and the silence waits for someone to act. The choice is yours. Either you let arrogance win by default, or you decide that knowledge, composure, and truth are weapons sharper than any gavel. Stand up, speak steady, carry the lesson forward, because the Constitution isn't just a book on a shelf, it's a voice waiting for you to use it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.